Okay, before I close, Dr. Bill and Jim are going to be here to answer any questions or take questions from anybody. I do not want this thing to get out of hand. So, I want everybody to be respectful. And like I said, I don't feel anything going out of hand here. So, I'm going to leave that being said. Item number 17 is adjournment. Do I hear a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
All right, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor? Aye. All right, thank everybody for being here. This is a controversial issue, but it does not need to lead to argument or anything else. Everybody needs to be respectful. So, with that said, I'll leave that to the rest of the people here. If y'all have any questions for Dr. Bill or Jim, that y'all go ahead and answer. Brad?
Dr. Hutchinson, could you go to your graph, the one that showed rainfall and spring flow and pumping?
Okay.
That one's fine.
You want an acre feet or CFS?
Either one of those is fine. Those are the two graphs that were the ones that I looked at that kind of, they were a little bit eyebrow raising, I suppose. So you stated a while ago that you didn't feel like the pumping was the primary impactor, and I agree, because I understand how the Edwards aquifer works, that it's a rainfall recharged aquifer. That certainly the primary driver in the lack of spring flow is going to be rainfall. However, I look at that graph and I see what historically looks like an unprecedented level of pumping all at the same time.
Yep.
So,
You're correct.
Is it your contention that if that level of pumping that you see in that spike after 2020, that if that level of pumping was to be cut in half, that it would have minimal or no impact on the spring flow?
Because look at 2011, 2012, 2013.
I do look at
spring
2011,
flow.
2012, and 2013,
The spring
and I don't see that level of pumping.
May I finish? Look at the spring flow, the green line. It's as low or lower than it is currently. The red line is in the 3,000 to 5,000 acre foot range, and the rainfall is a little bit lower than what we've had historically. This is one of
The Devil's River minnow that used to be in the spring is gone.
well, I mean,
Yeah.
so
And
I'm dealing with.
I know. There's no endangered species there now. Yes, I understand.
So the management concept here revolves around the permitted wells, the permitted uses. That's how the district was created, to create those existing and historic uses. The charge of the district, as you read, was it you that read the management plan?
I
Mission
just read
statement.
off the website.
Yeah.
Yes.
The balancing between those property rights, permit holders, and protection of the spring flow. In 2010, the board, this district's board, adopted a desired future condition that sought to manage long-term historic spring flow. That included the pumping that had occurred. The problem, there was a disconnect between what the permits provided and what the actual spring flow protection was. And we talked all about that in September. So we do have a problem in the sense of what's been permitted. We don't have a problem with what actually has been pumped, because the historic spring flow DFC has been met every year. So it's a different management objective here versus Uvalde versus San Antonio versus Austin versus a lot of other places. But you have to start with, what are you trying to protect? What are you trying to accomplish? That's really where it begins.
So if the board adopted a policy that the idea was to protect the spring flow, that would create a different management objective?
A different level of spring flow protection. Right now they do have a spring flow protection desired future condition. that is sustainable, that is defined. If a new board or this board changed to a higher level of spring flow protection, that would mean less pumping. Any one of the, or they could have, I mean, you could
Maybe go the other way.
You can go the other way and say, you know what, the spring's going to dry up a lot of the time anyway, what the hell, pump more. All these are perfectly legitimate under Chapter 36 of the Water Code, perfectly legitimate policy options that this board has. The one that's been chosen was originally chosen in 2010. It's not as high as some people would like. It's probably higher than other people would like. That's where this balancing comes in that's required in Chapter 36. This board is the only one that creates and defines that balance. And my job is just to provide the information to the board to say, if you do this, this is what will happen, or if you want to do this, this is how you, the technical part of it. Somehow I've gotten swirled into this whole tornado, which I don't understand because I don't really have a stake in it one way or the other. I'm just providing technical information to the board.
Okay, one last question, and I'll sit down and let somebody else. I teach high school biology, but my training is in evolutionary biology, focusing on reptiles and amphibians.
Cool.
You give two biologists the same data set, and I know this is a fact because I've watched them do it.
Yeah.
You give two biologists the same data set, and they come to two different conclusions.
Yep.
Would you characterize that also to be true if we took the data set that you have available and handed it to another hydrologist?
Let's take even a half a step back. What is science? One of the key features of science is reproducible results. Right? Would you agree with that? This is why I put everything on the Google Drive. So anybody can download the data, do what they want with it, see if I came up with if they come up with the same answer or a different one, and if it's different, why is it different? That's science, is to be transparent and to be able to reproduce information. This is why this was trouble. The numbers are just different. And these data have been available all along on the Google Drive. And to put down zero spring flow for 2022 and 2023 on an annual volume is just not true. It's low, but it's not zero. The pumping has gone up. The rainfall has not been happening for 5 years. And you were the one that talked about Fort Stockton. Do you know how much pumping we're talking about here versus Fort Stockton?
I'm sure that Fort Stockton is much higher.
This is maybe a tenth. This is maybe a tenth. Even at the highest levels now, we're talking about a tenth of what the pumping there. I work out there too, so I'm very familiar with that whole history and whole. Rule of capture did not start there. Rule of capture started in 1904 in Northeast Texas. They applied it here, but it wasn't ever a Supreme Court case. It never got to the Supreme Court. It started in the 50s, not the 60s. So just for you. But yeah, context-wise, the pumping we've got here is minuscule compared to over there. And that's why we still have, except for these extreme drought periods, there's still quite a bit of spring flow here, as opposed to there where only in wet years do you get a little bit of trickle in the wintertime. It's very different.
I'll sit down and let somebody else.
Dr. Hutchinson, Dave Palmer, a couple questions for you. That's my picture there in that thing. I don't know the source of that table, and honestly, nobody asked about that table at the thing and had any clue what it said.
Yeah, like I said, it just struck me. I saw the picture and I just struck me.
So it's inaccurate. I appreciate you putting that out, but I think models are not completely accurate either. And
These are not models.
I mean,
we're
models that we're creating are models that aren't perfectly accurate either. I'm not sure a perfectly accurate picture of what's going on in the county can ever be established. We've been working on models we've been trying to figure out what's going on in this county since the groundwater board was started, and it's a constant process, let's say. So anyway, so my question is,
can I ask you about your predicate?
what are you talking about?
I think he means that you base the information in the model off of satellite pictures and different data.
No.
Is that not correct?
No. That work is going on. What this is data.
That particular chart is data, but not the whole thing.
I know, but you gotta keep in mind, before you build a model, you have to understand what the data are telling you. Everything I presented in September, everything in here is trying to establish what the data are telling us. Because if the model does not tell us the same thing as the data, the model's not very good. This is what I was trying to deal with last summer, when I realized the pumping data wasn't quite right. Some of the geology I didn't think was quite right. But please do not confuse this with the model. And I would also take exception to, since the district was formed. When the district was formed, they did not do any of this level of work.
Okay.
The work that we're relying on from 1962, I mean, people have been thinking about this for a long time. But the problem is that when the district was formed, it was initially assaulted with a bunch of lawsuits, and we didn't actually get started on collecting data until about 2012 and 2013. So just some perspective and context in the history, and the fact that these are data that are telling us the filling and draining. That comes from Bennett and Sayer.
Okay.
1962.
Understood. So, what I would like to just comment on, you mentioned that if certain things are done, and I'm not going to say specifically, if you cut pumping to X, you might have 1 to 8 CFS.
That's what the data.
The
That's what the
impression
data
that we get when you present that is that's an insignificant amount of flow. To me, that is not an insignificant. That is not an unworthy goal. 1 to 8 CFS would be awesome for the fort. It'd be awesome for me personally. It'd be awesome for Stan Connolly, Will Connolly, most of the people that are conservation minded. We would love to have 1 to 8 CFS. Thank you very much. That would be great. Now we have 0 CFS, and I understand, just like Mr. Hibbett said, that rain, and like you said, rain, and like Mr. Burton said, rain is the major source of recharge. That's great. Only God controls rain. Like we pray for every meeting, pray for rain. That's awesome. But man can only control what man can control. And what I would request from Mr. Burton and you, Dr. Hutchinson, is suggestions on what man can do to control what man wants. So that to me is what the science should be moved towards, is what we can control. And pumping is the only thing we can control. And I know you produce the data and the board needs to decide what to do with it. But my plea to the board would be use what you do, use what Mr. Burton does to do what you can do as a board to get the creek flowing. I mean, we can't control rain. If it rains, everybody's happy, sweet. Yeah. But in the meantime, maybe we need to do what we can do about what we can do, which is pumping. And mandatory curtailments are used throughout the state, and we need to start talking about it. Yeah. And what it might be able to do. And if it only gives me 2 CFS, and not just me, this county, then let's try.
I just think you're misplacing the role of science in all this.
No, I'm not. I'm just you might think that, but I'm not. I think science needs to be used to help man do what man can do.
Well,
is that not correct?
Let me finish. You talked about how I should and Jim should somehow get on board with this, and you also made it sound like
I didn't say that.
1 to 8 CFS somehow I was characterizing as insignificant.
That's what it appears.
Well, in the context of what I've heard, which is get rid of pumping and we're back to 20 CFS.
Who said that? Who said
Who says
that?
that?
Nobody's ever.
Who said that?
Who said
Who's
said
your
that I,
source?
who said that I said that pumping had no effect on spring flow?
I don't know that either. Who said that?
It was in the paper.
Let's
Well,
set the record straight today. No one, I believe, in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, thinks, for one, that rainfall is not the primary determinant of all this, but pumping is also a determinant. And also,
Who's going to own up to me saying that pumping had no effect on spring flow?
I've been saying the opposite.
Oh, and that we would all be happy with minimum spring flow. And I think, Mr. Palmer, you were clear that you appealed to the board to make the policy decision. And just appeal
That's the
to-
point. That's
to-
the point. It's
yes.
a policy decision. My role is to go through all this and say 1 to 8 CFS. It's your job to
Understood.
say, hey, 1 to 8's great.
Understood.
1 to 8 is great.
If that's what you think, other people may say. Other people may say.
No, that's,
That's
not
not
going to be
that's
a
not worth the
universal.
trouble. That's not worth the trouble.
I could fix that.
Oh,
So,
If I could, we're getting a little far afield. That the idea is questions about the data, about where it's, data availability and so forth. Dave's right, I mean, about policy decisions, but that's not what we solved tonight. It is a policy decision. But could we continue with questions? Gentlemen here.
I don't envy you. I'll just say that. So I don't have any threatening questions for you, but I did take some notes on your stuff. I believe, and there may be some people in this room that are a little more familiar with this, but I believe also in 1962 or shortly thereafter, the dams were built outside of town. The dams were not adequate for the amount of rainfall that we truly received because data was not accurate back then. And it was off by a pretty considerable amount. You referenced the Nueces River comes up, X amount of rainfall, 1.42 inches at the west prong, east prong of the Nueces River. You kind of said that in your slides.
yes, the 1.6 inches of recharge based on Bennett and Sayers' flow record analysis from 1940 to 1950.
So, but you mentioned something in 1962, what Sayer had said about,
They did the report in 62.
but they're
Based
lacking
on,
from the 40s.
that part of the study was based on flow records from 40 to 50.
Well, I think my point would just be that it seems as though if we're going to pull from, we're going to start just a linear effect here. If we're going to start a calibration or a model based off of using data, there's a really good chance, because it's already happened in this city,
Right.
that some of that could be completely wrong.
No. I'm not explaining it correctly.
Okay.
1940 to 1950 gives us the 1.6
Okay.
as an average. What I did, and if you read the report that I wrote, what I do is I take this zone map and the rainfall and say, how do I get recharge into the system that is generally consistent with what Bennett and Sayer said? Because I only put the Bennett and Sayer because that's the origin of it, but there have been several studies since then that seem to confirm that order of magnitude number. And so what I'm trying to do is spatially and temporally distribute that, because just knowing it's 1.6 on average is nice to know, but I need to know how much it goes up, how much it goes down, essentially on a quarterly basis. So and that's all in this report, in this Tech Memo 10. So I would encourage you to download that. You can see at least what my first stab at it is as a foundation for moving into calibration and making adjustments.
Okay, thank you. And I will with very, very curious. My second question would be, we could probably sit here, I'm not going to sit here all night, but there's probably a lot of people that sit here all night and talk about this. But I think maybe that's something that's not really being described as forecasting. We can't forecast rain. We probably really can't forecast pumping and how much we would need, right? Because if we got some rain, we would have to pump as much. So there's really no forecasting anything. But what we can look at, based off your graphs, is that for the last 5 years, the average rainfall's been a little over 17 inches, 18 inches, whatever it's been. And if that trend continued and pumping did increase, my question would be, is that I think we got to wrap our minds around this entire big picture, which we're saying on one side of our mouth, well, pumping's not having an effect on anything, and that very well may be a scientific. I'm not attacking you. I'm not. So I'm just.
You just said what I didn't say.
No, I know. I'm not saying you. I'm just saying that you know that's being thrown around. That say pumping doesn't affect anything or not significantly, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just I'm making a comment. And then you have another party over here saying, well, you know, it is, right? My question would be is that if the trend continued, does pumping with no rain make it increasingly harder for it to then recharge? So if we went another 5 years with only 17 or 18 inches of rain a year, the aquifer could recharge. And this is a genuine question because I do not understand reservoirs
You don't
underground.
understand where it's the lowering of the water level actually, in some respects, increases the ability to recharge.
Okay.
Not the opposite.
Yeah. Okay.
As water, you want to tell me more about how I don't think pumping affects
No, I just
the
said
spring
what?
flow?
I don't understand. I'm
All
not,
right.
that was
So you have a stream. Underneath it is a water table. The stream leaks out into the ground. If the water table is real high, there's nowhere for it to go and it runs off.
Okay.
So as you lower the water level, after a drought, then you have more ability. That's why after a big rain, when we get big rains again, hopefully in the next year or so, you will see a lot of rain, but you will see a lot less runoff because you got to pay that credit card bill. That water is going to go down into the ground first before it can run off. So you're going to wind up with, so just the opposite. As the water level goes down, we're not losing the ability to recharge. We're actually increasing it for a while until the water table fills back up.
That's all. That makes perfect sense. That's all. I mean, that's well said. I understand what you're saying.
So there was something else you said that I wanted to. There was another point you made about remind me. What did you say just before?
We were just talking about the 5 years.
The
dropping.
projections. Yeah. You didn't come to the September meeting.
No, sir.
Okay. The website has the presentation. A couple of things on there you'll be interested in.
Okay.
I plotted the rainfall that we've got, the 10-year average rainfall against some tree ring data that goes back to the early 1600s. To put into perspective the drought of the 50s, the drought a few years ago, and the one we're currently in. It's not pretty. There, in the early 1700s, there was a drought that makes the one from the 50s, the one we're in now, look like a picnic. So we are in a position to look at, and once, I know you don't like models, but that's one of the tools that you can use to help look at what if. What if there was a repeat of the drought of the early 1700s? You know, that sort of thing. So we can plan and project what's going on. The other thing you'll see in that presentation is I did an analysis of rainfall, evaporation, and increased aridity. We're seeing consistently since the 1950s here an increase in aridity, higher evaporation rates. That has a direct influence on what the irrigation demand is for irrigated farmland. So all these pieces are in place to be able to evaluate with imperfect models, but that's what we do. We evaluate that in the context of where could we see things going, at least, maybe not on a year-by-year basis, but at least as in a long-term planning context. That becomes important because the one thing you also have to remember, as I mentioned in 2010, this board, or the board that was in place at the time, adopted a desired future condition for long-term or average, basically historic average spring flow. Well, if pumping continues to go up, even from the levels that it is now, it's going to become increasingly difficult to meet that DFC. It's been met every year since then. But as time goes on, if it gets more arid, there's more demand for irrigation, more acreage goes in, there is the potential to not meet that DFC. And then there would have to be something to deal with. You know, this board would have to deal with that because that was their policy. So that's one of the reasons we do this kind of work, is to look forward and say, is there going to be a problem if these trends continue? Just what you were asking, if the pumping continued, if it got more arid, if there was a longer drought, would there be problems with meeting the DFC? And then the board has an option. Change the DFC, require less pumping, the whole variety, the whole range of possibilities. But yeah, this is why we do these kinds of things, and so I'd encourage you to go look at the September 28th presentation that's got that kind of information.
Thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
Dr. Hutchinson, a couple of times in your presentation, you referenced pumping issues being resolved. Can you explain what that means?
Yes. It's pretty well known that there's some issues with the pumping reports that the permittees are supposed to bring in or send in. This was what Jim was talking about. We were getting, one of the big problems that we discovered last year was a lot of the coordinates for the permits were incorrect. We had some wells that were supposed to be north of the highway that were actually south of the highway. Things were mislabeled. Things were duplicated. It took some time to kind of go through all that. So the pumping issues had to do with the mechanics of all that. I know there's a lot of misinformation about why I did the satellite work. Folks think I just wanted to ditch all the actual data and use the satellite estimates, and that's incorrect. We knew there were some problems with the permit reports. Those had been identified. Satellite work helped us bring some context and something to compare those reports to in order to make sure they're correct. So we're not relying solely on either one. We're using a combination of the two to try and understand and how to improve the permitting report system.
And let me,
just real quick, so this pumping issue, resolving the pumping issues, you make reference to specific pumping quantities. In fact, I think you said it's gone up to 11,000 most recently. The pumping issues that you're focused on don't call into question in your mind the quantities. It's other logistical things, or am I kind of virgin about it?
If you we have 51 permits, historic use permits. When you take the numbers and add them up, this last year it's 10,251. That number we think is pretty good based on the overall work that we did with the satellite work. They seem to track reasonably well. Where we have problems, and one of the things with the groundwater model is you want to have point-by-point specific pumping. Not just the total is not as useful as knowing point by point. Well, if the permit says the well is here, and everything we know says the well is here, and these are over 10 miles apart, that's a problem. That's the pumping problems that we had to resolve. Where are the wells? And this goes back to 2003, when all these permit applications were submitted. I really don't know what the due diligence was done at the time to understand how they came up with some of this stuff. Some of it's a bit of a head scratcher, and some of it is just incorrect information, and it's taken some time to sort it all out.
Thank you.
I told you I had no more questions, but his presentation, and both of y'all, or either one of you can address this. The city well is 1,500 feet deep.
City well number 2, that's correct.
The city well by the water tower.
Yeah, 1481.
Is that the same? Basically with the spring and all this business along the springs that line Highway 90 from here to San Antonio, there's an impermeable layer or a not as permeable layer that causes the groundwater flow to come up and pop up along Highway 90. Is that city well tapping into a different aquifer, or is it all the same?
It taps into the Edwards.
It's the same. It's the same as the spring.
The spring comes out of the Edwards.
Okay,
most of the wells, especially the ones in Pinto Valley, they're in the Edwards. When you get to the south, it gets a little more complicated. But basically, for the purposes of the spring pumping in Pinto Valley in most of the area, they're all headwards. And it's just that deep. And that's what makes it remarkable, is that that karst development is that deep. And those, and the wells yield very, very good, very well. I mean, you saw the Fort Clark well, mud well number 2. It responds, what, a couple of feet?
Off 1 foot.
And that's maybe less than 50 feet from the pumped well. You don't see that in a sand aquifer. That's a karst system.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both for your presentations. Can we go back to the graph, the bar graph with the spring flow and precipitation?
You want acre feet
yes.
or CFS?
CFS, please.
Okay.
This one, and I understand we're all in such a rough spot with the reliability of historic data we have, so spotty, and I wouldn't know this unless we reached out to the data chief of USGS to get some context around the location of the gauge for Las Moras spring flow, and what they told us was enlightening to me because they said that the gauge was moved in 2014 because prior to that there was erroneous data being spit out because of the management practices of the pool and releasing it like you kind of hinted to. So
There was some structural problems too.
Right, yes. But with that gauge data being as unreliable as it is, and with one of the primary points made when this slide was being pulled up, being that around 2012, spring flow was near zero, like it is today. Although today we have the gauge in a good spot, in 2012 we had the gauge in a bad spot where it was taking a lot of zero flow readings when it wasn't zero flow. I wonder if that might skew those
Sure.
results, or at least the interpretation that's brought out of these.
Yeah, and I knew about all the move the gauge. I was here when that was happening, working with the district, and we were, what are we going to do? That's one of the reasons I did what I did in that tech memo last June, that statistical analysis. And I actually looked at, I don't know if I really elaborated on it in the report, but I did look at the 2 data sets, if you will, pre-14 and post-14. And yeah, there's a little bit of difference, but some of it's maybe significant with respect to problems with the gauge. Maybe it's just different, weather. I don't know. I don't think for some of the big picture stuff, I don't think the interpretations are wrong in terms of using the entire data set. The shame would be to say, well, that old data is no good at all. We're not even going to consider it. We're only going to start with 2015. I think that would be a mistake. So we do have to look at the pre-14 data or pre-15 data with some degree of scrutiny to make sure. But I don't think it was so far off that it validates any ability to do any comparisons back then. And I think the statistical work that I did in the tech memo last June suggests that it's okay to use what we're doing, do what we're doing.
Bill, do you want to clarify what the issue was just with the gauge not capturing the recreational pool?
Yeah,
Do you want to explain what was wrong?
Some water was was essentially going around the gauge.
Right. So essentially any water that was being redirected to fill the recreational pool and then released back into the creek was not being captured by the gauge.
So maybe it's inappropriate to say that in 2012 we were in a similar position that we are in today.
Well, and this is one of the advantages in the chart that you all made, by doing it on a volumetric basis, actually helps mask a lot of that. If you're doing this kind of an analysis on a daily basis, yeah, there might be, but when you're throwing it all in as an annual, a lot of that works itself out, especially as it relates to filling and draining the pool. That sort of cancels itself out.
You know those numbers.
So the thing is that, yeah, it's low. Both the 2012 and 2023 points are low. Could the 2012 point be a little bit higher? Yeah, maybe. But does that invalidate the fact that they're similar, that the pumping was much lower back then, the rainfall pattern was dry, wet, dry. You know, and then again, this goes back to, this is what the data are telling us with all of its limitations, good or bad. The model will help clarify some of this once we get it up and running to make sure that we have the interpretations correct, because the model won't care about old gauge, new gauge. It just is doing, you know, what's coming out of the ground. So I don't think it's certainly a concern, it's certainly an issue, and I don't think, based on what I've seen in the data, I don't think it's something that's disqualifying to just throw out all the old data, old gauge data.
I would not suggest that.
Yeah. But use it with care.
Go ahead.
Alright, mine will be real short and sweet. This one is based on information you and Jim provided, the exact same information. And that is, a lot of us out here thinks that the flow would be returned to normal if all pumping was stopped. I have no idea where that information y'all could have got it. And if you and Jim are thinking that, and the board is thinking that, then y'all really have a wrong idea of what we believe.
I understand, but do you deny that there was a newspaper article that said, Bill Hutchinson said, pumping does not have an effect on spring flow?
I can honestly say I've bought 2 newspapers.
I mean, at the September meeting, I think she left. You know, when Greg Ellis was giving his talk, she starts waving the paper around, screaming at Greg to answer that question, even though it should have been directed at me. So there's a lot of, you know, rumor, misinformation, a little bit too much Facebook stuff.
Exactly.
You know, that kind of thing. I'm not on Facebook. I just hear about things.
I've never heard that on Facebook or anywhere.
No. There's never been any false
I've never heard a person
things on
say it or
Facebook.
read it on anything.
So it's
So hang on, let me, hang on just a second, let me just clarify something. I don't think that, what you just said, I don't believe that. And I've never said that y'all think that somehow it would come back to 100% or normal or whatever. I've never had that thought once in my head. So, and I didn't say that tonight.
All pumping should be stopped.
I don't think, don't put words in my mouth. I've never said that, nor do I think that.
Reduction.
I think explicitly in the presentation that Mr. Hutchinson gave in October, he said that if pumping were curtailed by several thousand feet or acre feet or whatever, then an increase of 3 to 8 would occur. And then I would assume, you know, the regular game of telephone got that misconstrued.
Yeah, well, that started in 22. In 2022, when the spring first went dry, the question was posed to me, if we shut off pumping, what would it do? I said, probably not very much. That then turned into this big thing that started, it even went on into September, that said, I didn't think pumping had any effect on spring flow. Will Connolly, I had that on the first slide to make sure that we were clear on that. And then you started playing journalism deposition games, asking me, does pumping affect spring flow? And I was like, what if I just stood up here for an hour? You know, that's exactly what I said. I've worked 40 years dealing with groundwater impacts, or impacts on surface water, shallow groundwater environments of groundwater pumping. That's what I do. It would be ridiculous of me to say that pumping does not affect spring flow. It's absurd. But that's what the paper said I said. And frankly, it's so exasperating that we're still here talking about this.
You know, if I ask a question? Look, I agree with you. I think, you know, the genesis to have you come down, which I'm very appreciative you came down, I think this is informative, was there's still conversation about does pumping affect spring flow. And it's not coming from you.
but it's out there. And so the thought was, let's bring Bill down so that he can tell everyone. And so that was the thought in September, was let's have Bill talk with everybody, get to the bottom of the science so we can understand what the science is. That is why I was very specific in asking a very simple question: does pumping affect sprinkler? Not to catch you, but to have you just very open to say it does.
Give us a slide.
But I think having the verbally saying it is helpful.
And how did it get in the newspaper? How did it get in the newspaper?
I don't know. I don't know what.
You don't know?
I don't know. I don't think that you've ever said that pumping is not impact sprinkler.
Hey, the word got around the state that that's what I said.
Well,
because of that newspaper article. It was not appreciated.
None of us write the articles.
I don't know.
Information.
All right, folks, we're getting far afield again.
No, we're getting right on point.
All right, questions?
So I guess.
All right, let's Bill didn't say it. Let's move on. Are there questions? Are there questions?
Put on a public article.
So my question is,
Hey, hold on, I can't hear Will. I can't hear Will.
real quick. So we said that, or you said that 1 to 8 spring flow would come back if we reduced pumping by how much? I don't want to put words in my mouth.
You are putting words in my mouth as usual.
Is it not 1 to 8?
What I said was, based on the analysis of the data that I did with the imperfect gauge data, that if pumping were to be reduced back to 4,000 to 5,000, I forget the number now, you would see an increase of 1 to 8, not bring it back.
Okay.
So if the water levels are low enough during an extraordinary drought, even that may not bring it back to 1 CFS if the water levels have kept going down. So it was a very specific thing of what the conditions in 22 and 23 were, not in the future or forever or under any condition.
Okay.
That's despite what David Palmer thinks, that's why you do models, is to help figure out and bound those kinds of those issues.
Bill, you don't need to attack me. We're just having a discussion. Like, you think what you think, I think what I think. Let's just
I've spent 2 years. I've spent 2 years getting attacked.
No, you're
I've
not
been
really
2
being
years
attacked.
of being drugged through the mud.
Okay.
I've come here to try and help this discussion.
Thank you.
But it's still with, I'm suggesting that 1 to 8 is not significant. That this is all model results. I mean, this is data.
Okay. Sweet. I like your dad.
Being listened to by humans who, can interpret things in different ways. I too felt like you said it was insignificant one day. So that was just I was wrong because you clearly think it is significant.
I think significance is a policy decision.
Mm-hmm.
What I do is provide the information. These guys are the ones that have to decide, is it significant? And this is where there's a big debate. There's a big debate now all over the place about the role of science in something like this.
So
I have a very different view than a lot of activist type scientists. My job, I think, is to be objective, provide the information, and stay out of the policy making. Maybe it's the way I was raised.
So in your opinion, can I ask you a question? What you do, who bridges the gap between what you do and what the board does?
Well,
because there's a gap between what you do and what the board does. Do you have any ideas or recommendations? Because the layman is trying to figure out what's going on, which is impossible almost. But who can bridge the gap between what you do and what the board does?
We'll talk about that tomorrow. Specifically, I have a presentation dealing with thresholds that y'all have been talking about in the rules committee. And maybe you'll get, instead of trying to answer it with some.
But I mean, what human can go between you and the board to figure out what is good?
I'm trying to avoid giving an academic level answer to an important question.
Cool.
And I think it may be better to do it on a practical, real example level tomorrow when we talk about thresholds. You can sort of see where I personally draw the line. Now, I'm not saying that others would go. I know some won't go as far as I do. I got criticized at the Water Development Board for going too far, and there's others that take it a lot further than I would. But tomorrow you will get a sense of where do I draw the line with respect to how I communicate information to the board to help them, because they're the ones that have to make the decision. I'm not one of these people, experts should run the world. I think policy people, elected officials should run the world, not someone like me.
Thank you.
So we'll see. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, I'm sure.
All right, thanks.
Okay, one more question.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, go
One more
ahead. Go
question.
ahead.
You said the DFC, we met the DFC the last 2 years. What years were those, and what was the DFC on those dates? Because it's what, January 1st or December 31st?
The DFC is measured based on December 31st spring flow. This is all in the September 28th presentation. And it's all in the management plan.
But the last 2 years, so we reached 24 CM.
No, that's part of the misinformation.
Okay.
The DFC is an average of 23 point something CFS. But as I explained in September, and as explained in the management plan, it's a concept called indexed compliance. In other words, if the average is 23, we know in dry years it'll be lower, and in wet years it'll be higher. And there's a chart in the management plan that explains all that, how that DFC is then translated to look at annual data. And once I've got the December 31st spring flow, it's been finalized by the USGS. I'm waiting for the next couple of weeks for the Water Development Board to finalize the rainfall data that I use for that. And so I imagine I'll write a letter, and at the next board meeting there'll be a report on whether the DFC was met in 2023.
So the DFC can change.
No. DFC is an average number,
Yeah.
but it's applied differently depending on how much rain there was the year before.
But it can change through policy that the board creates and gets approved.
Right. That cycle is every 5 years, and the next one is due on the proposal is May 1st, 2026. And so we're starting to get into the time when that discussion will occur. And that's part of the other reason to get all this work wrapped up, so we can have a cogent discussion about what the options are at that point.
Well, what was the spring flow? December 31st, 2022, 23?
The 23 was a little over 2 CFS. 22, I don't remember offhand, but it was low. It was like in the 2 to 4 range. I don't remember.
Okay.
But it's in a letter I wrote last, I think it was May. I write a letter each year saying, are we meeting it or are we not meeting it? And the management plan talks about all the steps in that. So I would encourage you to download the management plan, and I would encourage you to, because I talk about it in great detail in the September presentation.
So the 2 and the 4 from 22 to 23, those met the DFC as it's currently defined?
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
remember that graph with the scatter points and the band?
Yeah.
So that defines the range that we would expect to be consistent with that.
Is that a standard deviation? Like, is it some sort of variance, or is that
it was variance based on the spring flows.
Just to be clear, Will, you said 22 and 23. You mean, because 23, we're just looking at the numbers now.
I guess that's right. I meant, so we don't know in 23 yet.
That's correct.
23, we have the spring flow.
Well, we're just waiting for the rainfall. So
the spring flow is about 2, but I'm waiting for the last 3 months of rainfall.
Okay.
The letter I did in May talks about 22, and I just don't remember the specific number, but it was within the band.
Well, it just seems like a big range between 2 cubic feet per second and 24 cubic feet per second, which is, my understanding was what the DFC was, is 24.
Yes, as a long-term average.
Average.
A long-term average is 24. It's
Sounds
explained
like it
in
would take 500 years.
This has been a discussion that we've had quite a bit, and so let's.
We went through all this when the management plan was being developed. I went through the entire process. Then there were folks that weren't involved in that had a million questions, and Facebook stuff went crazy from what I understand. So that's why I went through in gory detail in September. And now we've got someone new again who hasn't heard all these stories. So, like I said, read what's written. Read the approach. It's not a new approach. It's something I didn't make it up. It's used in water management everywhere in the country. This index compliance approach. So I mean, people mock it because, oh, how can 2 CFS mean 24? You know, it's like, well, I know what the purpose of that comment is, but just all I can do is say, read what we've got.
I'll read it in a new light. I've read it before.
I think I have a question for both Mr. Burton and
We'll have his hand.
Oh, sorry.
Well, alright, I'll just get through this real quick. So just going back to my question here on the 1 to 8. So it's a 1 to 8 increase, and it was going from what level of pumping to what new level of pumping would have caused a 1 to 8.
Well, do me a favor. You're putting him. It's on the slides. You can download it. He's going to give you the presentation.
It's not a general statement. It was specific to 22 and 23,
right.
21 and 22. That if the pumping had been lower, we would have expected about 1 to 8 increase in the spring flow. You constantly try and turn it into something larger. It was a specific analysis based on comparing 21 and 22 with 3 or 4 different periods.
Yeah, I think you know my point. I mean, you understand my point. I think it's fair to leave it to people to decide whether what was pumped in 22, 23, and what reduction would have caused an increase in spring flow is relevant to them or not. And I think what correct me please if I'm misquoting you on this. I just want to make sure that I understand this correctly and this is understood. Is that pumping was about 9,500, 10,000 in that year, 22. And you said that if we brought it down from 9,500 to about 4,500, correct me if I'm wrong, that we would have seen an increase, or that would have a increasing effect of spring flow of 1 to 8 CFS.
Correct.
So my question is, if I'm not saying you would cancel all pumping, I'm wanting to understand what pumping represents of spring flow. Can you what would the impact be if you took it all the way down to 0 to where you understand what is the impact in CFS terms that pumping is having on the springs? Would you double that 1 to 8 to 2 to 16?
You're assuming linearity in
right.
arsenic system.
Right.
That's foolish.
And what
you cannot assume linearity in a situation like this. That is not a good idea.
So what would be the response to that question?
It's an academic question because it extends it out to beyond what the data are. You know regression well enough. You don't extend past what your data are. You're trying to gain insights essentially in between. So we've never seen a situation in the data in the record where there was 0 pumping. Because there were always people here, at least, probably since the 40s, there's been pumping, at least on some level. Bennett and Sayer talked about that in their 62 report. So what the spring flow would be under 0 pumping is sort of an academic question of very little relevance. And so all I'm trying to do is you could run it in the model. I don't know how reliable it would be. And that's something I can do. But I think more practically, looking at comparing the 21 and 22 data with data from previous periods like I showed in September is far more instructive to get a sense of what the range would be, what the magnitude would be, And what the longevity of it, now the problem is that 21 and 22, we're still dealing with no spikes in rainfall where some of those other periods, there were intervening wet years. So it's hard to tease out some of the other variables in that, or some of the other influences, like residuals from wet years. So it's not a precise thing, and it never will be. Now the other thing, to make sure it's clear, is that's sort of a global statement about the pumping. Now where you might do that, how does that affect it? That could also play into it.
Okay, sure. Fair enough. And on the, where pumping impacts. So based on what we currently know today, is Pinto Valley connected to the springs?
Probably. I mean, everything I've seen suggests that, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Okay. In the rules committee meeting, there's been a lot of talk about the dye test, and so I've put together a series of slides that go over the dye test in detail and explain what it means and what it doesn't mean.
Okay. And then on the recharge question we were talking about earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong on repeating the explanation here, is the explanation was that depleting the reservoir will actually help with the, I'm going to call it the rate of recharge. And is that
no, that's not what I said.
Okay, you said it will help with recharge.
No, what I was answering the question that was linking decreased water levels, that somehow that would destroy the ability of the aquifer to recharge. In other words, it would break it so it could never recharge again. And I was talking about a simple hydraulic concept that if water levels are at the bottom of the stream, it's not going to recharge, it's going to run off. If water levels are below the stream, then water will infiltrate into the ground, causing the water level to rise. Well, if the water level starts here, you're going to get recharged until it hits here. But if it starts down here, you're going to have a longer period of recharge depending on how long it rains. So I wouldn't make a blanket statement that droughts are good for recharge, because it's a very contextual thing, and I was trying to respond to the question in the sense that it's not breaking it. It all depends on where the water level is, and this is one of the dangers of trying to answer these questions, because something like that can get twisted very quickly and put in the newspaper or put on Facebook as somehow I think droughts are a good thing because it increases the recharge.
Well, that's not what I was
You may not, but I guarantee you something like that could happen based on what I've seen over the last 2 years.
I was actually agreeing with you that it makes sense to me that if you have less water in the reservoir, you've got lower pressure there, and water flows to the area of lower pressure.
Not a pressure. No, don't go there. That's not pressure. That's head. Because now we're in a recharge area. We're in an unconfined part of the aquifer. I know you're a petroleum guy. You're dealing with everything is pressure. What we're dealing with, oh, thank you so much. How'd you know? How'd you know?
I could tell.
My voice.
Yeah, your voice was getting weaker.
So, what we're dealing with is in the outcrop area, way up to the north. That Edwards is on the surface. So the water comes out of the stream and goes directly into the Edwards. Then it flows down gradient. As it flows down gradient, it gets underneath the upper Cretaceous, the Del Rio clay and all that stuff. Now it becomes pressurized. There's no recharge when water flows through the creeks here. There's no recharge to the Edwards. That's all happening up north. So don't confuse the term pressure in the outcrop area with hydraulic head. It's very different.
Okay. On the model that was put together in wherever it was in November, that was giving weird results. What were the weird results?
The weird results are water wasn't moving in the right direction. Water levels weren't tracking correctly because I was trying different combinations of conduits and barriers with faults. I wasn't sure if the vertical discretization was correct. You see, we've added more layers to get a better representation of that. Now we have a discrete layer that causes confinement rather than just sort of lumping it all together down below, down below. So that there were a number of issues that said, you know what, and then I wasn't even sure on the locations of the pumping because we were still having trouble with the old records. And every time Jim would find something, I'm like, how can I trust any of this until we get it nailed down 100%? We talked about the pumping issues. The pumping issues had more to do with where the wells were located than anything else, and what formation they were completed. And when you get further south, some of the wells are Edwards, some are Austin Chalk, and the records are not crystal clear on that. So now this goes back to when they permitted them in 2003, and like I said, I don't know what kind of due diligence they did at the time, but it's rough.
And that was essentially, when the initial permits were issued in 2004 or whatever, they gave coordinates for the wells, and people would turn their pumping reports in, and there wasn't many. There maybe was one or two that were 10 miles apart that were just not being used, but there were where one was on one side of the field and it really was over here. They were just wrong, and and that was when the permits were originally issued in 2004 But so we've gone out and we've been having to try to fix this, locate this for the last couple of years. And so Bill, when he's developing the model, it makes a difference for him if he's 600 feet away over here pumping out of the Austin, or I'm right here pumping out of the Edwards.
Well, and even before I turn the model on, when I'm comparing the locations of the pumping reports and these pumped wells and their amounts with the satellite work that we did, it's like, where's this field from? Whose wells are these?
How are you getting 200 acre feet out of an area right here and there's no irrigation? But we've got irrigation over here, but you don't have a well that's over there. And so correcting those locations has been an exercise that we've been working on for a couple of years.
So is it fixed now, or is it still being fixed?
No, it's done. It's fixed. And Gage has asked me for photos of all the meters and all that. It's one of our
missions. But you know where they are now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this was part of the idea is that we knew it was going to take a little while to sort this out. Why not take advantage of the time and fix the geologic framework that we knew was suspect at the time, or at least it wasn't as robust as it could have been given the code that we're using. It was perfectly appropriate for the code in 2010, but now we can take advantage of a better code to get better structure in the model. And so I figured, while he's doing that, I can get my geologist to do the geologic update, and then we can get back on the model late in the spring, early in the summer.
Wait. There was a question here.
It's on the same topic. It's just a tail end question. Just quick
Yes,
clarification.
No, she's had her hand up 6 times.
Don't lose your thought.
Please, if 7's your lucky time.
If you can go back to the graph with the blue, there you go.
This one?
The other one.
Do you like CFS or do you like
the next one? Okay,
You like
so
CFS, all right.
I'm just gonna say that we got lucky in 2004 and whatever that is, 2007, and got a heck of a lot of rain. That probably maybe it was an El Nino year, and I'll have to go back and look at it. And this is, and we're kind of below average in our rain, and across the state of Texas, the general trend has been, especially central Texas, from west to east, the general trend has been that the rain amounts have been going down. We're not getting the 22 that we normally get, or we're getting in the new number 19 or something.
Were you at the meeting in September?
I was not.
Okay.
Was that discussed in there?
The aridity thing that I talked about earlier.
Yes, I understand that.
That the evaporation has been going up. The rainfall has been down slightly. And so that increases the demand essentially the demand on irrigation for an acre of land. You need to irrigate more because it's hotter and drier and less rainfall. Okay. I did the same analysis for an area just east of Austin, about the same time. Not there. Rainfall, evaporation, no trend.
Yeah.
So there's something about it here that at least over the last 60 years, there seems to be a bit of a trend. I don't know if it's a longer term thing. I've heard stories, everyone talks about the dry line moving east. Well, if it is, we're seeing it here, but we're not seeing it in Bastrop and Lee counties yet.
Okay.
So I have done that work, and that was one of the reasons when I was doing it about the same time, and I thought, I wonder if I'll see the same thing over here. Nope, didn't see it there. So I haven't had a chance to do it other places yet.
So there's hope for you to get more than 17 inches of rain. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean,
hopefully up there with all the recharges.
The past is the key to the present. That's what we're supposed to believe, right?
Teach that.
So, we see this. I looked at the tree ring stuff. This too shall pass.
Yeah.
When? Who knows? I mean, I had great hopes this spring, but it hadn't really, or last fall first, and then this spring, and it hadn't panned out, so maybe we're in for another year. I don't know.
Yeah, and once it passes, it'll come
I
back.
understand that we're in for a La Nina event, which is going to be the super dry.
Yeah, those don't always pan out because, what was it? Last year, this year California got bombarded. It was a lot, it was a La Nina year. So who knows?
I thought we were in El Nino year.
This year, last year.
Yes.
It was even worse, and that was La Nina year. So it doesn't 100%, but it's just more information in the hopper for us to hope and pray. It'll end. We just don't know when.
I just think that you could use these. I think you said something about you do some forecasting predictions with your data because data doesn't lie. It's making these predictions and looking at these models, and I'm like, if the general trend is rain is teetering off. We're not getting as much rain. We're not getting much rain where we need it.
But see, that's part of
the trend of pumping is going up. It just makes sense to make policies in this policy.
Read the recharge memo, because what I did in that is I built in both inputs or rainfall and evaporation, and then I have a bunch of factors to kind of distribute it. So the key thing there is that I can control, when I do simulations in the future, I can vary the trend in rainfall. I can vary the trend in evaporation to evaluate those exact things. Because one of the key elements that I have to give this board information on relative to DFCs is, can you meet them? If we set a DFC that based on the trends in the weather or the climate suggests that this is going to be hard to beat, they need to know that before they set it.
Yeah.
So that's exact. So I've got that built in to be able to address those kinds of questions. They're not accurate in the sense of I know what's going to happen in the next 5 years, but I know what direction things might be going.
Yes.
And I got the old tree ring data to help me out.
A question about the well locations and the 2024 field data that was gathered.
24?
Yes. You and Martino went out this year and have been working hard to take measurements and take photos of wells. And some of the wells that I believe are in the Edwards Trinity are noted as pulling brackish water. Would that be a result of a misalignment between the documented well location and the actual location, or is it communication between aquifers and a pressure issue?
Most of the wells that were not identified correctly are actually not being used. Okay? And so there are some I'm sorry, ask your question again.
Why would brackish water show up in an Edwards Trinity?
Wait, let's back up.
Yeah,
you're defining Edwards Trinity by virtue of what it says on the permit application, as distinguished from an Edwards well, as distinguished from an Austin Chalk well. Okay, those are wrong.
Yeah, some of those.
The Edwards, no. The whole concept of Edwards and Edwards Trinity is a construct of Water Development Board maps that were used to make a distinction. You see this, I put up the geology, hell, even the old geology. You don't see Edwards Trinity or Trinity, or Edwards. You see Edwards and Trinity. The Edwards is one layer, the Trinity is one layer. The distinction that was made years ago between the Edwards and the Edwards Trinity is that even in San Antonio, the Trinity is underneath the Edwards, but all the wells are drilled into the Edwards. So they classified that as the Edwards area. As you move out west, it's still the same geology, Edwards on top of Trinity. It's just that the characteristics of them are less defined, and the wells, some wells are drilled into the Edwards, some are into Trinity, and they just lumped it together because it's hell, it's West Texas, they don't care. Geologically, there's nothing different. I mean, there's faults and stuff, but in terms of depositional facies, it's Edwards on top of Trinity. And so in the permit applications back in the day, they distinguished between the two for reasons that I have been led to. It had to do with the boundaries of the major aquifers, which then turned into the bases of the GMAs. That's why Kitty is in two different GMAs. GMA 10 is the Edwards. GMA 7 is the Edwards Trinity. But they're constructs of that map. They're not real. And so one of the challenges we've had is in putting this together, the data that are included in the permit applications say Edwards Trinity or Edwards. That has no meaning in what we're doing. We wanted locations, and we wanted to make sure that everything, and I know they built these maps and I hated them when they did them. I told them not to do it, but they did it anyway. Because they lead to wrong impressions. That just because of that line, folks think that if it's on one side of the line or on the other side of the line, those wells are in different aquifers. No, they're in the same zone. They're in the same geologic unit.
Thank you for that information. That's really helpful. But my question was more about like the communication with Austin Chalk, because I understand that's brackish water, but both of the Edwards are not brackish water.
Some of the Edwards is.
But,
okay. When you get far enough down gradient, the Edwards does go salty. Yeah.
So the wells that were showing sulfur water, were those south of the gradient, or were there some
those are in the
other
Edwards. The sulfur water wells are in the Edwards. The Austin Chalk is good water. The shallow wells coming out of the Austin Chalk is good water.
And think about why that is. It's getting recharged. The Austin Chalk is the surficial unit. So rainfall, a little bit of rainfall that comes down, it does actually recharge and there's circulation. The Edwards down there is real deep. And as the water flows to that down gradient in that direction, it gets tighter and tighter. And the flow slows down. That water's been there for a long time, it gets saltier. And there is communication between the two, but we have not fully defined or got a full quantification of that yet.
So the Austin Chalk recharges from falling on the ground?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
well,
so
just like
occurs that way.
Yeah, just like here.
And it's shallow. I mean, it's a couple hundred feet.
And it's good water gauge.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
Remember that. It's good water.
Austin Chalk is good
Tastes
water.
good.
You got something to say?
Doesn't smell.
You might.
It's just
That's absolutely not true.
See there?
Spofford Austin Chalk.
That yellowish color. There's the yellow and there's sort of the off yellow. That's the Austin Chalk upland. The yellow are the channels in the Austin Chalk. And so there's plenty of opportunity for recharge in that area, and that feeds those Austin Chalk, what are called Austin Chalk wells, south of the highway. And that's why it's decent quality, is that's relatively young recharged water that's circulating in the shallow system, as opposed to the deeper stuff that's come all the way from this red area all the way down.
And the Edwards at that point is pressurized. Right? So
yeah.
Okay. I have another question, and this is for Mr. Burton. If you could pull up the slide with the spring flow, I think the last graph. And before Easter, dropping before Easter. And it's going to be a really general question, and I'm not looking for any certain answer.
This one you're talking about?
Yes. So this phenomenon, you weren't able to say definitively what the cause of it is, but
it just happened. So we're looking at it.
Yeah. Might a cause of it be accumulated or concentrated groundwater pumping
Where?
in the county?
Where?
Well,
In the county. And does the concentration of pumping in an area have more of an impact on how much is able to...
Right. And we'll talk about this in more detail. I've got diagram and stuff for tomorrow. But in general, when you see something like that, you think pumping, or as Jim described, in a karstic aquifer, there was some quantum change. In other words, this is not just like a homogeneous sand aquifer. In a homogeneous sand aquifer, pumping would probably be the biggest culprit here. In a karstic aquifer, you sort of get these quantum jumps. And so if water, when the water was turned out into the pool, if that coincidentally happened, water levels drop. Water levels may drop smoothly in a sand aquifer, but they could drop in chunks in a karstic aquifer. So this may be something related to pumping, it may be a contributing to pumping, but it could be something related to the karst system. And that's what we've got to look at. Like you said, it just happened, so we haven't had a chance to really dive into this.
It did, though, just anecdotally, this spring when it went dry last summer and the summer before that, it did happen in April or May, within a week.
Yeah,
I think.
and that's
so
when pumps, and that's when pumps turn on. So it certainly is a possibility. It's right on the edge. So, but see, this is one of the reasons why having this gauge is so important. Before, all we had was the USGS gauge. And so as it's getting lower and lower, it starts, accuracy starts waning because you're on that stage thing. This thing is a sensor right in the pool. So even as it goes below, where you have zero flow, we'll still be able to track how far down it is.
And what is the missing data that could help y'all understand where pumping is occurring that's impacting this? Like, if pumping is what's impacting that spring flow drop.
Well, you got to give us some time. My God, this just happened to.
No, but I'm asking. Yes,
we have the data. We have the data. We haven't had time to look at it.
Okay, so there's no missing data to determine the cause of this.
Missing time. we have other things, and this. I mean, this is the first time I saw it. Today. Jim looked at it. Obviously, he put the graph together, and he's been compiling the pumping data. We've been trying to get ready for today and tomorrow. So we just haven't had time to. I mean, this is one of these things. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If you put this on today, because you get a question like this, hell, we haven't had time to look at it.
I think what it means is, is there missing technology, missing measurement, like flow meters or things like that? That if that was on every well, it would help eliminate.
The biggest thing is if there's. It's like with this whole thing about spring flow. What causes it to go up or down? There's two variables, pumping and rainfall. And sometimes one can mask the other. The pumping here is relatively low, so sometimes it's hard to pick up that signal. So in this case, what may happen is there may be too many signals to definitively say what it is. And so we know that's there. One of the advantages of this network, or this probe, this monitoring point, is that we'll be able to watch this over different periods of time to see what else is going on and maybe narrow it down. We may not nail it on this first one because it's just one point. But over time, we may be able to figure out, where this is coming from. But it's a process. It takes time. It takes a little patience.
You've got 3 wells that are in very, very close proximity, pumping from the same depth as where the spring is getting the water. The first thing is you look at the stuff that's closest. I've been building this network since 2013. Every data point helps. It gives you something to look at. And so what you're getting at is, do you need more data points? Absolutely. We want to continue to build more data points. One of the things in my slide said I've got 6 units right now ready to go deploy. and we've got more coming in the fall. We're continuing to do this. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. You know, I look at that. I got that data right at Easter. I look at this every day. And it just happened on the same day that they diverted water out of the pool. It's just, you know, maybe on the same day or maybe whatever lag time. Maybe it's coincidental, maybe it's not, I don't know. But at some point, this is something we need to look at. And it's data that I'm presenting to everybody. This is what we need to look at.
Is this data from your equipment or from the USGS gauge?
It's my equipment.
Okay, so the pool diverting wouldn't affect that?
No, absolutely, because it's our equipment that's...
In the spring basin, it's not over by the pool.
But
You know how they fill the pool up with the boards?
You know how they fill the recreational pool? They take water out of the spring and they fill the...
Only if it passes the flow gate, they don't pump it.
Stopped, so we just got money.
Well, but when this happened, Jason, you did. You diverted water out of the spring to fill that up.
No, we actually didn't. We paid it to be pumped out.
Thank y'all for clarifying that.
Okay, you know what? That is a great point of clarification. I did not realize. I was told that the spring was filled up for Easter for that. Okay, well then
But I think, Jim, just to clarify too, the way the system works is when the pool is full, there's a gate, and of course Chris knows all this too, there's a channel over here, and then when it overflows that channel, it has to get to a certain height before we can even fill the pool.
Yes.
So,
and
whether or not we fill the pool or not, whether the pool's gone, the channel's gone, it doesn't really matter. The water's still exiting. It doesn't not exit because we fill the pool or we close the channel.
No, that I understand. But the head in the spring was at 10 feet, right? And so you did. So
we didn't take water out of the holding pond or open the gate and drain it down. It's closed off.
That, you know what? That is a great. That's not what I was told. That's not what I was told.
It was like crystal clear water from the hose.
Chris could answer this too. I don't think we've opened that gate that comes out of the discharge channel. I don't think we've opened that gate in years.
Well, no, yeah.
And they're the people to ask.
No, I get. I know him very well. I mean, this is. But
So the way this works, Jim, is that we're saying that if there's a drawdown of the head of the spring retention pond, that the water level in the pond was drawn down.
Yeah.
And that's what this mechanical, we're saying we mechanically put something here.
So what I have watched for, I don't know, for a while, is when did you stop taking water out of the natural spring to fill the pool?
We can get that. We can get you that date.
Yeah, I mean, something like that would be extremely helpful because what I see in the graphs is the rising and lowering of this, of the natural spring basin, and the rising and lowering of the USGS gauge when you release water out of the recreational pool. There's a brief moment of time where the USGS
spikes.
It spikes and then it comes back down. And at the same time, there's a lowering of the spring pool, and it's been filling back up. And I've watched that in the graphs, and then from what I thought was happening, and when I called and asked or whatever, maybe I asked the wrong people, and Jason, I should have called you. I did ask the wrong people. Thank you. Thank you. She's shaking her head, agreeing with me. Yeah, I got him. I asked the wrong people.
Just encouraging.
Yeah. Right. Okay. But what I've been watching is that when the recreational pool empties, USGS goes up, it comes back down. The natural spring equipment in there that lowers, and then it comes back up. That all happened about this time, is what I'm looking at. And so, if that's not correct, that helps me divert my attention and resources to find another.
I mean, but the reason we filled the pool is because the flow went to zero and there was nothing to be had.
And what
so
did
it goes to zero?
Okay, wait, but the flow going to zero, Jason, is the USGS gauge.
Yeah.
Right? I'm talking about
no, you're saying with your own eyes.
I'm just saying there's no water that was going over the gate.
Yeah,
no water
okay.
going into the pool. It was just sitting there. It wasn't raising.
Right,
The
perfect.
head pressure was stopping it from flowing anymore. And then I guess the pressure went down and it went ground.
Okay, perfect. That's great information. Thank you.
So these little blips, the smaller little mountains there.
Yeah, That's when it goes down and goes back up.
And what's the mechanical cause of that?
Operation of the pool.
It being drained out of the pool,
Yeah,
the
and the pool.
man-made pool into the
Right.
creek.
In the drain school.
I mean,
And if you dive in, Jason has all this data, by the way. You've got every piece of information. Okay, the mud has all this data. And if you zoom in on these squiggly lines, you can see where the surface is going up and down when mud is pumping. So you can see the 3 to 5 inches when mud is pumping. And so something happened right there, and I'm presenting it transparent. Everybody, let's talk about it. Whatever you want to do, let's look at it.
I mean, the other time when the spring flow went to zero and didn't reach.
When you say spring flow went to zero, do you mean the overflow from the natural basin?
Yeah, there's nothing coming out of that retention pond. There's like it's
Okay,
stopped.
so all right, so
And
the
then
overflow
last
is going
time
to
it
zero.
stopped, it went back into the ground pretty quickly. Like
Yes. Well, and
Yeah,
that looks like that's about what's just about to happen based
So
on
it
that.
happened before the last time. It
Yeah.
goes to
And-
zero, then down a foot. Down
And
a
Gage,
foot,
your question, you're saying, is there a combination of pumping in Pinto Valley? Are they the ones that's causing it, or
Or southwest of 90, there's irrigation pumping a lot
That's
close
it.
to the spring.
That's in the Austin Chalk. Those are 200 feet deep in clear, crystal clear water, great water that it's not going down in the deep 1,000-foot pressurized Edwards. Those are
That
two.
would, pumping in that area would have no effect on Edwards.
I'm not even.
I don't know. I
you
don't
can't.
know.
I'm sorry, I'm
There's when a well is pumped, three things happen. The water level goes down, and as a result of that gradient that's created, it's capturing water. And that captured water is either induced inflow from somewhere else or captured natural outflow. Captured natural outflow is spring flow. Induced inflow can be bringing it in from another watershed or something. We'll talk about this tomorrow. But basically, the fact that you have Austin Chalk wells up here, could they have down gradient of a deep source spring? It would have to then have some effect if you lower the head in the Austin Chalk. Does that have effect immediately below it in terms of changing the head in the deeper formation? Possibly.
Okay.
Possibly, then that would translate all the way back to the spring. That's what we're trying to figure out. Now, if you remember, in that monitoring map, there was a big gap southwest of the spring, down towards all those irrigated fields in those Austin Chalk that are pumped by those Austin Chalk wells. 2 years ago, I said we need more monitoring wells down here because I don't know. You remember all the correlations I did with the water levels and the spring flow? That was a big gap, and that would help answer that question. So we've added some additional data points there. We've only had the data now for about a year, something like that.
Maybe. So we've got some that are longer.
Quick question about I think I want to say Satoff, but Satoff, is that who's next to the fort on the southwest side of the fort where the irrigation is?
I don't know the names.
I'm
just talking about the field.
West, way west.
So I've heard it said that who was saying engaged in the rules committee that their water was brackish and had no effect on it.
Well, Sawed-Off is pumping a lot of sulfur water, and that's deep Edwards aquifer water.
Okay, so the claim was made that those brackish, or what do you call it, sulfur water?
You can
So
bracket.
the claim
It's
was
all
made
sulfur.
that sulfur water was not linked in any way to the spring.
They
Is that
were
inaccurate,
pointing
or
to
that's
these
an
maps.
unknown at this point?
They're
Okay.
referencing.
I don't know what somebody else is saying.
Yeah, I know.
claiming.
I'm just saying there was some claims.
If I remember correctly, the context of that had a lot to do with the dye study. The dye study is not definitive. It's not a definitive thing when you're dealing with capture of a pumped well. It's great for just how things generally move, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
tomorrow.
there was a lot of questions
We'll
in the
talk
rules
about that
committee
tomorrow.
about that. So
We'll talk about that tomorrow.
So let's wrap this up real quick. It's good. I saw Marty yawn a minute ago.
Long day.
If the young people are yawning,
Well, Bill, I think you touched on a very great point, which is, and I'm asking you this, is it possible that the Austin Chalk is communicating with the Edwards and the Trinity?
It's more than it's likely. The question becomes, what is the quantitatively? What's the connection? We don't know. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out, number one, where these wells are. Are they Austin Chalk wells or the Edwards wells? Where are they located? We didn't have good locations on some of them. We were missing some context and monitoring well data. We're getting that now. These things are ongoing to understand that. Nothing is ruled in or ruled out until we have data and evidence to try and figure out, well, what are we seeing? It was important to get that monitor in because the USGS gauge has limitations, especially when they, put water in the pool, those spikes, something's going on there. Well, it's just a pool. Well, can't do anything with that. This is a lot more instructive in terms of being able to track minor differences in the spring pressure. Yeah. We were already seeing the benefits of that because we can see the mud well effect, not too far away, but we can correlate those effects.
I've been trying to get an insert in this for 2 years to watch exactly this. This is get it in when there's water. I want to see it go down, why it's going down, how much it's going down. Try to figure out where that's coming. And I don't have an agenda to go point and blame or do something to somewhere. I want to look at all of the information. This just happened. This is what we're watching. Why? Why is this happening? Who turned on? There was a couple people that are not here or no whatever, but somebody just started pumping. Well, did they just start pumping at this exact same time, there and about, depending on how far they are away? Is that the reason? I don't know. Let's look.
All right. At this point, stay tuned next week.
Well, just a quick related
real quick. Will, we're done.
Sulfur questions. Is it possible to have sulfur, brackish water, fresh water in the same reservoir, and they're all communicating? Meaning, is sulfur or brackish water proof that you're not touching the freshwater reservoir?
No, you're talking about in a steady state system as it was developed. The fact that it's brackish water suggests that it's not moving very much. When it's overlain by an Austin Chalk aquifer that has fresh water, that suggests that it is circulating. So as long as you don't pump anything, there's no connection. As soon as you start pumping one or the other, you are setting up a condition where there could be induced communication, induced flow. That's what we're interested in. So to blanket say that you're pumping from a deeper source doesn't necessarily, it's just like the dye test argument. The dye test can't do anything for you in terms of what capture is. Capture is a very important part of hydrogeology. It's why, models were developed, or why we use them, is to be able to understand the dynamics of the flow system and make sure we understand it in 3 dimensions in a very complex geologic environment.
Thank you. Great. So appreciate that.
Thank everyone, especially waiting this late.
Thank you for
everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.